A quick agenda and a bit of background to what I'm going to talk about today. Well, first of all, it's really great to be here. I have followed the BIM at BOSS initiative pretty much since it started, and I've been, I think, at each forum, and they get better every year. And they get more diverse every year, and I really truly believe it's an industry, it's our industry event, the key event we have in Australia. Saying that and looking at the illustrious round of speakers we had so far today, I realized I needed to talk about something else, something you might not have heard of so much, but something, as we just heard from David, is certainly coming up. Product lifecycle management and its integration into the construction industry is something that is coming up. Enterprise resource planning is coming up as well. So a bit of background to this particular presentation. It was put together initially for a presentation I gave in Yokohama a few weeks ago, actually exactly a month ago. It was a conference, and I think we have one of the organizers here, Julie Jubb from UTS, where BIM and PLM was brought together, and there was an understanding, so how could we learn from each other, or how can we at BIM learn from the PLM guys, because they have been at it for quite a while now, for 20, 30 years. And there were some interesting outcomes, and I will reflect on some of those outcomes, but I will also show, because I don't want to be too theoretical, I will show you one leading example of what we do here in Australia on the basis of what Hickory currently is doing here in Melbourne. So agenda is a bit of background, the often parallel worlds of BIM, ERP, and PLM. Then BIM as an enabler. I will not touch on BIM too much because everyone has heard about BIM by now, so I don't want to dwell there. And then I will give you the Hickory example towards the end. Some conclusions as well. Now, when you look at those parallel worlds, the first thing that I noticed was when you look at the sort of literature and the way they're being described, you get the wheel of death from the PLM guys when it comes to how they describe what PLM is doing. It's about, well, system engineering, product portfolio, looking at product design, manufacturing process management, product data management, but very often in these sort of diagrams you get the wheel as a description of what it is, and PLM obviously sitting right in the center there. You know, when you look at ERP, funny enough, it all looks very similar somehow. It has different topics related to the wheel, though. It's about resource planning, purchasing, storage. It's a very transactional based sort of field. QA, change management, productivity management, and so forth. And lastly, BIM, some diagrams, who would have guessed we have the wheel of death again. So obviously there are some parallels in the way you describe what these systems, what these approaches do. We do here, we probably need it in the industry. So what is it? Let's dig a bit deeper about what it is that we look at when we look at PLM and ERP. A bit of a flashback in terms of history. Has been developed more in car manufacturing, aerospace, and shipbuilding, really an approach to manage information, to manage data. It was initially started off as product data management, really, and only over time it started to evolve into the life cycle, product life cycle management. So some points to make here, it, as I said, started more in car manufacturing, aerospace, and so forth. It's now moving more and more, and it was some of the outcomes during the conference. I think they want to move away from product and being tied into product, and I think they're moving more, the whole field is moving more into services and service delivery, which was interesting, I found. And it's getting ever broader, looking at sustainability as well. Sustainability is something that we have touched on with BIM for quite a number of years now. It's about shortening a time frame from concept to sales, reducing development costs, and so forth. Manage and improve the product quality and cost. Very similar topics, I would argue. You could pick 4 or 5 out of those and pretty much put it on a BIM, put a BIM tag on it as well, and that will work somehow. ERP, again, quite similar. It is more transactional. It's more also related to your resource planning, human resource, and so forth. You obviously want to avoid data duplication. It's the same with PLM and BIM. Location agnostic, so you want to implement it across your enterprise, centralized systems, server-based systems, maybe in the cloud even. You want to manage information across an enterprise in its totality. Web-based, centralized, as I said, cloud services, access, and some of the gains or some of the advantages identified by some ERP users is internal efficiencies, enable growth, standardized business processes, improved customer experience. Well, with BIM, that's still a bit of a question, but probably yes, and reduce costs. And again, With those descriptors, you could very easily map that on the BIM realm as well. So there seem to be parallel worlds in a way that start to engage with each other more and more. And one of the reasons for that is that we are dealing with more and more information on the projects that we deliver. So what we have learned now that as we become better with BIM and all these systems is that we start to learn how relevant the aspect of managing information has actually become and the value of information that we sit on. We heard a few examples today about how information is not really static, but how this is going to multiply and multiply and multiply. The example of, again, in 2009, more information has been produced, if you want to call it that way. I'm not sure it's information or data, but let's stick with information for a moment, than ever before in the entire humankind, and that's just amazing. But looking at where we have problems in the interface, well, there has been little precedence in the literature when we talk about, well, what do the academics say about that stuff, so it hasn't really been touched on much. There's difficulty in the alignment between the principles between BIM, ERP systems. One of the reasons is because ERP systems provide scalable solutions, again, I mentioned before, across the entire enterprise, whereas what we do in the BIM world very often still relates to project by project sort of experience. And again, we get reminded, I guess, on James's slide in early morning where he showed us that graph between the blue and the red line. Well, we don't seem to be very smart in learning from the projects and really advancing what we do in the construction industry based on precedents. In construction, most inter-organizational stakeholders work on one-off projects, again, relating to the previous points, and again, disparate information systems. So it's very hard to integrate these systems across various stakeholders. And the effort is quite huge to implement these sort of systems, so you can really only do it in larger scale organizations. When you look at who might then benefit from this sort of integration between this more systematized data management approach, it's most likely organizations with a large degree of offsite prefabrication, volume builders, but also equipment manufacturers with a high level of standardized components. And this is where the mechanical side, I believe, comes in as well. Graphically, if we look at how we could potentially connect these various systems, if we go from PLM and BIM, where's the common ground that we might want to find? And what it turns out to be is usually it's the bill of materials, or quantities, whatever we call it. In the manufacturing realm, it's bill of materials. And that really seems to be where the data, how can I say, fidelity has to happen, where really we have to come up with standardized data sets that allow us to at least link between those various fields. And that will also allow us then to integrate the ERP systems in something like that. With BIM as an enabler, I won't dwell on it too much. It's just the fact that we are not just replicating the processes that we have done like in the transition, let's say from manual to CAD. We've pretty much done on the computer what we would have done manually. With BIM, it's completely different. We have completely different workflows. It's highly disruptive. So we can't just imagine that the BIM process is just like moving over from CAD into CAD. I won't talk about that much because we heard about it a lot already. It is about the supply chain integration. It is about understanding to see a building as a product, if you want, and to analyze the different parts and components and the data associated to those parts and components. We're moving into an area where now clients do wake up, I believe. I think we were a bit cynical this morning, but I do believe, and the fact we have 8 FM people in the room, this is already a sign for that. I do believe that clients are waking up and they will become very hungry. I'm not just an academic, I'm actually consulting also in the industry, and I have several clients who are very hungry about BIM and trying to understand what BIM is about. And once we have that, it's not just about the information we can suck out from project to project, but really it's about enterprise information models, city information models ultimately, as we know. Who hasn't seen that slide, I should probably ask, because most of you would have seen it, but what you would not have seen is my addition to the slide, which is this. And I think one of the key problems about this information loop, as it's often described, and I think Autodesk is very good in providing us with these general discussion starters, but I think we should use it as such and start the discussion, is to try and understand where do the manufacturers come in and the fabricators come in, because they have kind of been left out from that loop as it was. And that's one of the key questions, really. How can we go from the design situation, include the manufacturer and include that information, and then go to the builder? And one of the reasons why we struggle is because content is not good, data is not integrated, and so forth. I've got these slides from Dassault and Memco here presenting them. who were generously sharing that information, because Dassault has been in that space for a while. They've been quite successful with some of their tools there, and working from the experience that they had from aerospace and car. There's some great examples now with Skanska and a few others where they start to go into construction and applying these sort of systems and techniques. Really understanding from kind of conceptual level modularization into panelized structures, fabricatable components, and really the processes that are then required to engineer these sort of systems. A lot of off-site prefabrication, and we talked about that quite a bit today, and this is coming more and more into the construction industry. And if you want to do that, you need a manufacturing mindset really to make it work. And you need the right sort of interfaces that allow you to really combine that information, and not just with a focus on the geometry, but really with a focus on the information, with the focus of sharing information, with the focus on comparing different data sets across a variety of aspects that are relevant to your enterprise. And this is where, again, both PLM and ERP come in. I don't want to bore you with too much theoretical stuff, so here's some examples from Hickory. I came across their sort of workflow about a year and a half, nearly 2 years ago, and I still haven't seen in the construction industry, in the Western world at least, I haven't seen anything that parallels their approach, and they seem to be quite out there at the moment in experimenting, if you want. They had some support, I think, from Radstack, who wrote a document for them about the ERP integration that would have happened about half a year ago. And they were very open and willing to share with me and to tell the story that they have gone through. For those of you who don't know, Hickory have different business sections, one of them Unitised. We're looking into a modular construction, or actually Unitised construction as they call it. In a way, they are looking at shells that they are fitting out on the factory floor for various purposes. I think they started predominantly in residential, have moved more into sort of sanitary pods, and now really open up into healthcare and so forth, and I will show some examples there. That's just one of their examples of a project. I think it's in WA that just recently got up. But for them, and I talked to their guys about how they managed that transition from a construction-focused enterprise into a manufacturing-focused enterprise. One key aspect was that they got key people in, well, they got experts in from the car manufacturing industry. There's quite an opportunity at the moment that I would argue we see in Australia with an imploding car manufacturing industry of getting that expertise into construction and allowing us to excel with what we are doing and introducing us to that sort of manufacturing mindset. So they had to consolidate different information systems across their enterprise into a centralized data storage and management environment. They had to have a strong focus on front-loading design efforts in order to identify and validate different options, so the kind of versioning process, really streamlining that to understand their assembly requirements and fabrication requirements. They needed to really identify clear naming conventions, nomenclatures, and really be very conscious about the data flow that was required from PLM, BIM, and ERP. Knowledge engineering based on analysis of prototypes, so there was a lot of lead-in time and prototyping that was required for them to actually be able to start. A revised tool ecology, and in their case that meant that they had to drop Revit, and they embraced Inventor as the key tool for their sort of integration with PLM, because they're working with Autodesk Vault, and Inventor and Vault are actually talking quite nicely to each other. So yeah, they had to reskill in that regard as well. And they introduced detailed process plans to clarify, define hold-up points, and identify high-risk items. So really manage the entire workflow to a very high level of detail. This is some images of their factory floor. What it really allowed them to do is to streamline those processes, really from early conceptual, how can I say, from the first point of fabrication, really, through the entire supply chain, and to then kind of wrapping up these and packing up these units and then shipping them all across Australia. In a way that was not really the end goal for them. I mean, what you see here, that's kind of how they have now mapped out the process. They have the architectural plans to still work with designers, obviously, but very soon kind of identify the detailed componentry, production of the bill of materials, which is kind of the key stepping stone here, really, with the integration between PLM and ERP, generating shop drawings, and anything that comes off it is pretty much kind of a side effect or an after effect of the work that has been done up front. In more detail, if we look at the sort of model that they have now adopted in their office, they're all on the factory floor here in Brooklyn and Melbourne. They start off with the inventor model. They exchange information, and there's various inputs, obviously, to that inventor model. Exchange information via Vault, and that then also ties into the Epicure ERP system. And the interesting part, I think, of this diagram that you see here is not necessarily the top part, but it's the bottom part, where you see a mirrored system happening in their Chinese facility. They're currently building up that facility. And so the end goal is not necessarily just to become more efficient in their approach here in Australia, but their end goal is really to be able to create that system, set that system up once, and then being able to export that wherever it is in the world that they can produce and manufacture the cheapest. They're telling me they're only going to China because they're wanting to build houses for the Chinese market. I have to take their word for that, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see a few pots or a few shells coming down to Australia as well at some point. They have now taken further their ideas about, not just ideas, but their workflow related to housing and residential units, and they are now at the point where they have fully fit out sort of hospital pods, and you see one of their prototypes here on the left, and I think they're, as we speak, already in production for this sort of hospital pod. I was able to convince them to give me a few slides that show that sort of inventor model. It gives you a bit of an idea of how they're doing the integration with the mechanical systems and the structural system in there. Overall, they've done some studies where they could clearly identify how the cost savings were happening for them. Yes, of course, there's a lot of lead-in time, there's a lot of preparation work required, but they're now really reaping the benefits of these sort of process changes that they have engaged in. You can see the comparative chart here, how they were able to cut down on the construction duration on some of their projects. Conclusions? First of all, the construction industry aims to find a closer match between the virtual representations of building components and the physical counterparts. And I think we've seen a number of examples today anyway. And that's great work that's currently happening, also facilitated by the BIM MEBOS initiative here in Australia on the mechanical side. It's just amazing to see what's happening there. We have reached a level of maturity where data fidelity is sufficiently resolved for interaction between PLM systems and further also ERP systems via the bill of materials. They can feed, as I said, into these ERP processes to help drive the production line as well as manage the organizational aspects and business aspects of an enterprise. Changing the mentality from a traditional mindset towards a highly engineered manufacturing and production line that doesn't occur overnight, but it's really highly pivotal that we switch in that regard. We switch from a construction mindset to a manufacturing mindset. To give you an example, I was told as a side effect, you pay someone on their factory floor probably half of what they would get paid on site. But once you establish your system and once it's well set up, you can actually export that, and you can export it geographically. You can well, it's enormously, the value is actually not necessarily in your factory itself, but the value is in the production line that you have established and the IP that sits behind it. And I think that's it for me. Any questions?